All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. When we look back at the history of American school segregation, it's really easy to just assume it was a byproduct of its time, right? Like some passive flaw in an older society. But the reality is far more deliberate than that. School segregation absolutely was not a glitch in the system. It was a carefully designed structure that was specifically meant to protect a racial hierarchy. So here's our roadmap for understanding how this all worked. We're going to deconstruct these fictions step by step, starting with the foundation of power, the legal fictions they created, the use of pseudoscience and social control, the major turning point in the courts, how this expanded way beyond the South, and finally, the deepest historical reality beneath it all.
Part 1. The Foundation of Power.
Let's set the stage. In 1865, slavery is officially abolished by the 13th Amendment. And during Reconstruction, we actually see this genuine, federally backed push for rights. You've got formerly enslaved African Americans voting, holding office, and building schools. But as you can imagine, that progress was quickly viewed as a massive threat by those in power. By 1877, Reconstruction falls apart, and restrictive Jim Crow laws swoop in to take its place. Then, boom, 1896, the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson decision legalizes segregation, and schools became the primary target of these laws, for one simple reason. Schools shape the future. Which brings us to part 2, the legal fiction. That 1896 Plessy ruling, it handed segregationists their ultimate legal shield, separate but equal. The whole argument was basically, hey, we're not denying anyone an education, we're just organizing things a little differently. But if you look at the reality on the ground, it completely shattered that claim. Black schools were given broken-down buildings, incredibly outdated materials, overcrowded classrooms, and drastically less funding. Separate but equal was a pure legal fiction, and it successfully protected segregation for nearly 60 years.
All right, Part 3. Pseudoscience and Social Control.
Now, to back up these laws, segregationists leaned heavily into scientific racism and eugenics. This was the totally false, pseudoscientific belief that different races actually had inherently different intellectual abilities. Psychologists were out there using heavily biased IQ tests to supposedly prove these differences. What they conveniently left out, though, was that these tests were massively culturally biased. They completely ignored things like extreme poverty, unequal school funding, and systemic literacy barriers. They essentially starved a plant of water and sunlight and then blamed the plant for not growing. And they also love to hide behind this idea of preserving social order, claiming that integration would just cause widespread violence. But what were they actually terrified of? Well, interracial friendships, interracial dating and marriage, political equality, and basically any real challenge to white authority. Because schools are the very place where children form their fundamental ideas about citizenship, integrated education threatened the complete collapse of their racial hierarchy. And when the fake science and social panic weren't quite enough, they actually pulled out their religious shield. You literally had ministers standing at the pulpit claiming the Bible itself supported racial separation and that God created races for entirely different purposes. They branded this the natural order, essentially weaponizing faith and turning the church into a literal battleground over equality and morality. Moving on to part 4, the turning point. So, this brings up a pretty massive question. After nearly 60 years of legal, scientific, social, and religious excuses, how on earth do you dismantle a system that is built entirely on fictions? Well, in 1954, the Supreme Court finally delivered the fatal blow with Brown v. Board of Education. The ruling was crystal clear. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. They officially ripped apart the idea that segregation could ever be fair. And crucially, they acknowledged something profound: the deep psychological damage that segregation inflicted, inherently teaching Black children that they were somehow lesser. But let's be real, that ruling did not just end segregation overnight. Actually, it sparked a furious, massive backlash that literally became known as massive resistance. Rather than integrate, some districts went to absolute extremes. In places like Prince Edward County, Virginia, officials completely closed all of their public schools for 5 years. They used threats, they used violence, and they quickly funneled public tax money into opening private, all-white academies instead. Which brings us to part 5, beyond the South. Here is a crucial point we have to understand. Segregation didn't just die after Brown v. Board. It just changed its clothes and expanded its reach. This is what we call de facto segregation. It's segregation that happens through hidden social systems and everyday practices, rather than explicit written laws. This concept explains exactly how the system shapeshifted to keep schools completely segregated in northern and western states.
So how exactly did they do this without laws on the books? Through housing discrimination, sneaky neighborhood zoning, completely unequal school funding, and creatively rigging those district boundaries. This meant that even without explicit Jim Crow laws, schools in the North and West remained deeply and deliberately separated by design.
And this wasn't just a black and white issue. This systemic division stretched right across demographics. Down in the Southwest, Mexican-American children were routinely forced into entirely separate schools. Local officials justified this with the totally false claim that these students were intellectually inferior, or that they simply needed to be segregated in order to be properly Americanized. And for Native American children, segregation took an incredibly brutal form: boarding schools. These were not just separate facilities, you guys. They were institutions explicitly engineered to erase indigenous culture entirely. Students were harshly punished for speaking their native languages or practicing any of their traditions, resulting in this systematic, deeply intentional erasure of their identity.
Finally, Part 6, the deepest reality.
When you really strip away all those fictions peddled to the public, the fake science, the weaponized religion, all those manufactured fears, you hit the absolute bedrock foundation of this system. Segregation was never, ever about the actual quality of education. It was a calculated economic and political weapon. By controlling education, you control voting access, employment opportunities, and wealth generation. It was literally designed to trap minorities and low-paying jobs so they could maintain white economic and political power.
And why does this matter so much today? Because understanding this history shows us exactly how the historical blueprints of racism can still mirror systemic issues in our modern institutions. Discrimination isn't just about individual prejudice. It becomes deeply embedded in laws, institutions, city planning, and just everyday life.
I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on regarding that permanent link between the classroom and our democracy. If education is so intimately connected to opportunity and freedom, what happens to a society when its foundational systems were built on fictions? Thank you so much for exploring this history with me today. I really hope it leaves you wanting to look just a little bit closer at the systems operating all around us.